Are you up to date on what's happening with renewable energy? It is a fascinating industry that is changing just like any other tech space at a rapid pace. The problem is a lot of the news and media that's coming out is based on what happened 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. And that is a problem because that is affecting how people see renewable energy in the future, even though behind the scenes, renewable energy is increasing in every country. It's a really interesting thing that we're going to talk about on today's episode because I have Mark Zacharias, who is the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada. He is here to talk about an article that was written on the Fraser Institute website, which is not really known as the best type of information. And he had some comments on an article that talked about how renewable energy is going to be a lot more expensive than we think. He refutes that. We talk about it on today's episode. So this is the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Angelo, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. If this is your first time here, your second time here, or you want to know more about the ocean because you're just like, there's a lot going on in the world today. We hear climate change, we hear oceans. How do we worry about it? How do we fix it? How do we do all this stuff about it? You can do so by just going to our website, speakupforblue.com. We have over 1,700 episodes just on this podcast alone. Plus, we are part of a little bit of a network, and we have more episodes on sharks, on veterinarians and marine veterinarians. We have it on wildlife biology and wildlife biologists. We have everything. So go over to speakupforblue.com and click that. And if you can't go over to the site every time and you want that information coming to your inbox, just go to speakupforblue.com/newsletter. You sign up your email for free. I don't share emails with anybody, and you get information to your inbox Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. Eastern, every Monday to Friday. So speakupforblue.com/newsletter for that information. All right. We're talking to Mark Zacharias, Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada today. He's going to talk about an article that he commented on. I found his article on LinkedIn, or his commentary on LinkedIn, basically saying, hey, look, this article is saying a lot of stuff, but it's a lot of the information is outdated. They're just kind of bringing it back. But there's been a lot of advancements over the last 10, 5, even 2, 3 years, and that we're really progressing on. In fact, there are some governments in Canada, provincial governments, that have actually been accelerating their investment and their projects on renewable energies, even though when they first came into power, the Ontario Conservatives were not having it. They canceled a bunch of contracts, but now they've actually increased it. And we also talk about the carbon tax. Oh, the carbon tax. It is the bane of existence for a lot of us, but it's done its job. We talk about how it's done its job. And Mark also talks about what could happen in the future if the new government that comes in October or whenever the next Canadian election is, will that carbon tax be there? And if it's not, what will happen? And what do we need to worry about, if we need to worry about anything at all? So we're going to talk all about that this interview. This is Mark Zacharias, Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada, talking about the article and carbon tax. Enjoy, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Mark, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about clean energy?
Absolutely.
All right, on. I'm so excited about this. Mark, you and I have known each other for a long time. We actually shared the same supervisor for our graduate work, believe it or not, way back in the day for both of us. And this is really fun because right now we're going to be talking about clean energy. There was an article that was put on a website, the Fraser Institute, that said clean energy is going to cost a lot of money. And you had some comments on that on LinkedIn, and I asked you, hey, let's talk about it on the podcast because I want people to hear some of the stuff that goes on and some of the information that was used, or some of the data that was used in that information. It was, used from like 19 years ago, as you mentioned before. And so I want to talk about what the new information is, what your comments are, and where we should be thinking about renewable energy in the future, especially some of the myths that are going on about renewable energy and the costs and sort of what it's going to do to our grid and everything. So we're going to get into all that. But before we do, Mark, can you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Mark Zacharias. I am the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada. We are a climate and clean energy think tank based out of Simon Fraser University, and we have offices across Canada.
Wonderful. And it's a great organization too. I love going on your website. You always have useful tips and strategies, and just like it almost explains the carbon tax so well. We had Yana on a number of months ago. We talked about the carbon tax. We talked about heat exchanger programs in Canada. But we're going to talk more today about an article that was put out by the Fraser Institute. Can you just tell us a little bit about that article?
Yeah, there's been a number of commentators recently that have basically put out three kind of different arguments around renewable energy and focusing a little bit on British Columbia, but really they're relevant Canada-wide and globally. The first one is that renewable energy costs too much and it's
Hmm.
intermittent, so therefore it makes grids less reliable and it drives up costs for the consumer at the end of the day, which you pay on your electricity rate. So that's kind of the first argument.
Yeah.
The second one is that climate policies will break the grid. So this
Hmm.
is things like EV sales mandates, it's things like heat pump mandates, it's banning natural gas and new developments, that all of this adds more stress to the electricity grid and will eventually overwhelm it or again drive up costs.
Right.
And I think the third argument you're seeing from a lot of groups across Canada is that Canadian utilities do import a lot of power in
Right.
certain situations. And so the suggestion is that by importing power, this means that you have some type of structural electricity deficit. And again, we want to kind of respond to all of these because there's nuggets of truth around all of these, and there's different examples worldwide where these things have happened. But right now in this day and time around the globe, most of these are incorrect.
Right. And I think one of the things that really bothers me about this type of information, especially around renewable energy, fossil fuels, it seems like the messages are corrupted on purpose. It seems like we've known from the past, like in from climate change and the climate change messaging coming from the decades past, that we know even oil companies have come out and said, yes, we actually perpetuated those climate denial types of information, and that climate change didn't exist and it was all a scheme done by environmentalists and so forth. And even now with renewable energy, I hear a lot of friends and family talk about renewable energy and you hear those myths that just continue to come up, and that misinformation that continues to come up and up and up. So, like the information that you talked about, that some of the stuff is true but also it's blown out of proportion or it's not using updated data, where's that information coming? Like, where's it deriving from?
There's a couple of points to make, and I think you've had a very good kind of setup for this conversation. That a lot of the information that people have in their heads that they've heard are things that were again relevant 10 or 15 years
Yeah.
ago. People constantly refer back to Kathleen Wynne and the Ontario government around renewable deployment, which was almost
Right.
10 years ago. And again, that was done in a way where technology was not cost effective, and the
Hmm.
rate design program actually drove up costs for consumers. So people remember that, and they keep coming back
Yeah.
to kind of what's transpired. The other part that we notice a lot, and more recently, is that renewable energy, EVs, heat pumps, they've all become part of the culture wars. And you're
Hmm.
either on Team EV or Team Renewable Energy, and or
Yeah.
you're not. And the
Yeah.
reality is that if you look at the U.S., for example, the states that have the five highest renewable and solar shares in their electricity system, they've got Republican governors. They've been Republican held. So, what you're seeing on the ground is very different than the stories that are being told in the media and on podcasts and other types of things. So it's really interesting.
It is interesting, but it's frustrating sometimes for me to continue to hear this kind of stuff. And you want the information coming forward, and that's what I love about your organization, is that it provides that information. And it's like you're an organization that just puts out the information and for anybody to read it. And I really enjoy how it's disseminated, because it makes it so easy to understand, because it can be complex, renewable energy and just energy sector in general, especially here in Canada. There's a lot of culture involvement in that, and history, good and bad. And it's nice to be able to find an organization that's ready to put out that information that's truthful and updated and follows that. I feel like we don't have enough of that. So thank you for you and your staff and your team to be able to do that. Now let's get into this article. You mentioned those 3 points. You had some 3 points like rebuttals in the end. So let's start with the beginning. That's it drives up cost, right? Renewable energies drives up cost. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and our experience and kind of looking worldwide in jurisdictions that are moving their electricity grids off of coal and natural gas and other fossil fuels has been actually the opposite. And let's look at some jurisdictions. South Australia is a great example. Their electricity grid 10 years ago was almost exclusively fossil powered,
Hmm.
natural gas and coal. And since then, because they don't have a lot of domestic reserves of coal, they had to import a lot of their energy. They made a conscious decision over multiple premiers during this time to actually switch to a renewable grid. So right now, their
Hmm.
grid is 75% wind and solar, and they have a very large proportion of battery storage. And then what they've been able to do is they've been able to commit that their grid will be 100% renewable powered, and that's all
Yeah.
solar, all grid, by 2027. And it's remarkable kind of what's happened there. The other ones I would look at is, some of the US states, like Iowa is a classic example. So they went all in wind a couple of years ago. So 55% of their electricity grid is
Wow.
now powered by wind. And that's a massive share. And
Yeah.
again, their electricity costs are 25% less than the US average. Even Texas, which has a 37% solar and wind share in their electricity system, their electricity costs, again, 25% less than the US average. So you can actually do it. And even if you look here at home in Canada, look over at Alberta. There was a renewable procurement a couple of years ago in Alberta, and they got power bids coming in around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's remarkable. And again, that's
Yeah.
the power that's produced. But if you look at the domestic Alberta electricity rate, it's almost 26 cents kilowatt hour. So the delta between what you can produce at versus what you can sell to the retail consumer at has a great opportunity to make money. So
Yeah.
there are examples all over the world. And, what I think people point to is they point to the examples that don't work, or where things have gone wrong, or where there's extenuating circumstances.
Yeah.
Everybody points to Germany, going, "Oh my God, look at electricity costs in Germany." And a couple of things happen there. One is they shut down nuclear plants. Two
Yeah.
is they are based in an EU electricity market that has a lot of kind of peculiarities to it that what happens is it can drive up electricity rates. And then they also point to the war in Ukraine, where Germany had made a bet on Russian gas and they had to get off fairly quickly. So
Right.
that's kind of an example. Another one people point to is California. Californians pay about 30 cents a kilowatt hour US for power, which is
Wow.
astronomical.
Yeah.
Compare that to the Canadian average around 15 or 16 cents Canadian, and there's quite a difference in that. And again, there's a whole bunch of structural issues kind of behind why
Yeah.
those power rates are so high. Some of them historical, and some of them more recent. The more recent ones are that they are having to rebuild their entire electricity grid because of climate change and in wildfires. So, all those costs
Ah,
get put back on the ratepayer. And
gotcha.
so, the answer at the end of the day is complicated. So, the bottom
Yeah.
line though is if you do it right, if you plan ahead, and if you actually have, all your facts together and everything lined up, you can build renewables into your grid and you can save money, address affordability, you can attract industry, you can do all sorts of things right. And maybe the last thing I'll say before you kind of jump to the next question is Ontario is such an interesting study right now.
Right.
If you remember when Doug Ford came in,
Yeah.
he canceled 700 plus renewable energy contracts. And in the last 2 years, the opposite has happened. Ontario has almost two Site C's worth of battery storage procurements that are now finished.
Hmm.
They're looking at building more renewables for the grid right now. They just announced last week $10+ billion to help homeowners switch to heat pumps and
Wow.
other technologies that are going to save them money and clean up the grid. So there's so many good things happening out there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny though. I live in Ontario. I haven't heard that, and I'm pretty. I follow this quite frequently. I wonder. And he's come out. Doug Ford, the premier, has come out very against renewables, saying it's cost like the costs are too high. Has it changed over his last 6 years now? I think he's on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Ontario, through its utilities and its regulators, have been looking at procuring more wind power, particularly from
Yeah.
some of the northern parts of the province. The battery storage and what they've done there
It's
is,
gotten
is
a lot
quite
better.
amazing.
Yeah.
They're bringing nuclear back online on
Yeah.
time, on budget. And in the atomic and nuclear world, that's almost unheard of to be able to do
Right.
that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, good on Ontario for,
Yeah.
kind of realizing the error of their ways when they first came into power and realizing that, hey, wait a minute, clean energy is something that a lot of foreign investment is looking for. And if
Yeah.
you look at the 50+ billion dollars of kind of automotive battery plants that have been landed in Canada,
It's
most in
huge.
Ontario, some in Quebec, that's all predicated on a clean grid. And if you look at these companies that have come into Ontario and rescued the automotive manufacturing
Yeah.
industry, the first thing they say is they say you've got affordable, reliable, cheap, clean power. And, the Ford administration has realized that.
Yeah, so it's not that necessarily they want to change. It's almost like they're forced to change to bring in more investment, to bring in more opportunities. Especially Ontario is known for its automotive sector, and it
Yeah.
was dying at one point. It wasn't very good at one point, and now it started to looks like it's reinvigorated with all these plants that we're going to be putting in for or changing over to the electric vehicles. So with Volkswagen and other places, so other companies. So that's wonderful, we're going to go on to the next question, and I want you to keep. And I'm sure you've been asked this question a number of times. You thought about it and talked about it a number of times. It seems at like the federal level, um, it they're not like one party is talking about renewable energies and we need to do more investment, and another party's not talking about that. It's talking about the opposite of that. It costs too much, and they're still on the cost. So because this question is all about the cost, why is the cost that was happened so long ago, like even over a decade ago, and the problems that we had there, why is that being brought back up, knowing that the cost has been reduced and that there's more opportunity? It's almost like we should be switching over and we should be making those investments or continuing to make those investments.
Yeah, and if you look at, for example, the federal conservatives and the federal liberals,
Yeah.
and to a lesser extent the NDP,
Yeah.
but the federal conservatives, have made part of their election platform clean energy. They do want to
Oh,
grow
really?
the grid. They want to build the grid. They want more nuclear. They don't talk about renewables as much or at all,
Hmm.
but unsaid is that's part of the equation. So I think anybody that wants to govern federally in Canada is going to realize fairly quickly that our grid is 83, 84% non-emitting, and that is a massive competitive advantage. The other
Right.
thing too is you get briefed up as a leader of any party, you realize that 8% of our electricity generation goes to the US. And the opportunity there for arbitrage and profit is fairly substantial.
Yeah.
So it is kind of known. Now, what the difference being is that each political party has a different way of getting there.
Hmm.
The federal government has its clean electricity
Right.
regulations, which stipulate that there's a carbon intensity for every unit of electricity produced. Obviously, some provinces object to that and have been objecting to that. The final rules are in place, and they've been adjusted a little bit to make sure Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and some of the other provinces can actually meet the 2035 target in
Yeah.
a way that has minimal effect on the ratepayer. But if
Right.
you look at the kind of more center right parties, they're kind of flipping it around a little bit, going, okay, we'll use tax incentives rather than regulation to get to the same place. So ultimately, I think all parties kind of know they need to get
Yeah.
to a massively expanded clean grid because it's in our competitive interests. And also too is if you look at what's happening down south around potential tariffs and
Yeah.
having more electricity up here that's clean allows us to basically manufacture products that we can now sell into Europe or we can sell into
Right.
Asia, where there is potentially a price premium on things that are clean. So
Right.
a huge opportunity there. So
Yeah.
I don't see the distance that a lot of people see between
Right.
various political parties, mainly because we're in the weeds and we're actually reading between the
Yeah.
lines. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a relief to know, because like it affects the way people vote. I mean, obviously
Yeah.
this election coming up for Canada, I think, is a little bit different, where it seems like maybe the Liberals have overstayed their welcome, or what have you, and it seems like the genuine sort of prognosis is that the Conservatives are going to get in. But it's scary for someone like myself who doesn't hear the federal Conservative Party talk about climate change or how they're going to address climate change other than carbon capture, which we know that technology is not completely there at this point. It's just really, it's nice to know that they actually have it in their platform. Maybe you have to do a little bit more research on their platform and where that's available. But it is nice to know that a lot of the political parties are moving towards that, because I think it's we're getting into dangerous territory here. With the fires down in LA, and we had fires a couple of last year, not 2 years ago, I guess, that were pretty extravagant, and even now it continues on now in certain parts of BC and so forth. So I think it's a little dangerous, but that's good to know. Let's go on to the second argument, which was I believe it was the energy. Is it drive up prices? No, what was the second?
Oh, the break the grid.
Break the grid,
which we hear a lot.
Yes. So talk about that. Like, what were they saying, and then what's your sort of commentary on that?
This has been a kind of refrain that's been said around the world many, many times, is that, particular EV sales mandates will create a situation that will overwhelm the electricity grid. Yes. Now, either at the macro level, at a provincial or state or national scale, or right down to your local level, that, they'll melt the transformers if everybody in your block gets an EV and charges at the same time. So, I mean, let's just start with EVs, then we'll work on heat pumps and other things like that. But the reality of the situation is that, EVs have a very small impact overall on the grid. So, if you look at, and again, I'll just take, Canada for an example, looking at 2 or 3% more electricity required in the coming years. And that's to actually support the EV sales mandates that are in place kind of federally and provincially, which are very ambitious.
Yeah.
BC's EV sales target is 90% by 2030 and 100% by 2035. The federal target is not far behind that. Yet, EVs are not massive consumers of the grid. And also, too, what people, tend to forget, you can go out today and you can buy an F-150 Lightning extended range. You can buy a Cybertruck. You can buy a Chevy Silverado kind of RST launch edition. All of these have vehicle to home charging capabilities. So your vehicle can store energy, push it back into your home for emergencies whenever needed. But that also means it's got vehicle to grid technologies. And there are pilots happening right now in the States where, utilities are signing up F-150 Lightning owners to actually sell power back to the grid in time and needs. So, here you are, and we're not very far away from the time where you will have an EV in your driveway. And it'll be plugged into your house, but it's also going to be plugged into the grid. And your utility, when you give them permission, can go and fish those electrons out of your car, bring them back to the grid, push them back in. So your car starts to not just be an appliance that sits there when you're not driving it. It actually starts, it's a moneymaker. That. And also, too, it contributes to grid capacity and resilience. So, that's just kind of one example of all this. And the other one, too, is, you live in Ontario, right? So you may be aware, but they have this overnight EV charging rate, just over 2 cents. So when you actually do the math, you can take a Hyundai Ioniq 5 EV, the one you see everywhere. It kind of looks like an 80s kind of a Hyundai. That will charge from 0 to 100% for $2.35 right now. And, compare that to a RAV4 with a 55-liter fuel tank. I think you guys pay around $1.70 or whatever for gas out there.
We're about $1.50, $1.60 right now.
$1.60, okay. Yeah. And so anyways, you're looking at $90 plus. So, so the EVs can not only, they can balance the grid, they can save homeowners money, both in driving them and in the future in terms of selling power back to the grid. So there are actually these massive mechanisms that will stabilize the grid over time, as adoption continues. So heat pumps are another really interesting one that people go, oh, when you switch out a natural gas furnace and you switch to a heat pump, a couple of things are happening there. One is, a heat pump is 3 to 5 times more efficient than a gas furnace. Why is that? Is, 1 joule of energy gives you many more joules of heat or cooling, just, how a heat pump works in terms of physics. And also too is, gas appliances are not 100% efficient. So, that's kind of one way that, overall you save energy. The other interesting thing is parts of Canada, particularly in the West and BC, 40% of developing dwellings in BC are heated through baseboards, and they're tremendously inefficient. So if you can actually
Yes.
switch out a dwelling that's currently heated with a baseboard to a heat pump, you get massive amounts of savings.
Yeah.
We've actually kind of figured it out that it's about $500 a year on your electricity bill you would save on your average
It's
dwelling.
crazy.
Just move into a heat pump from electric baseboard heating. So it's not
Yeah.
a climate thing. It's just
No.
a
Just
household
a saving
affordability
thing.
thing. Yeah. So then the other kind of piece of these arguments are that, natural gas bans and new construction, will overwhelm the grid. And again, very similar that because heat pumps are so efficient, and because you can actually now have appliances like smart thermostats where the grid can control and you can actually use your house as a virtual power plant, it's not the issue that people thought it was a couple of years ago.
Right, right. I think it's really interesting too because we've always talked about how, as a species, we have to innovate to get out of this climate change. Not only do we have to reduce our emissions, but we have to innovate, and it seems like we're doing that. And obviously, it takes time, and that evolution of that technology will always take time, and it'll be less cost effective at the beginning. And as we move through the progress, and as more and more people are using the technology, we get more efficient and more efficient, which it seems to be with heat pumps. It seems to be with EVs. It just seems like it's always there. It's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to get better. But it seems like a lot of people are just stuck in the past,
Yeah.
and they don't want to embrace the new information, or get the new information. And I know it changes quickly, just like the tech industry does, and so it's hard to keep up. But how come, from a mainstream media point of view, why aren't we hearing about these success stories more often than not?
But, because the way media works is you have to have narrative tension.
Right.
And when someone on a block buys a electric pickup and all the neighbors look at it and kind of go, what does it cost to fill it? And
Yeah.
the person says, oh, it's $10. And they go, what? And
Hmm.
then they realize that a F-150 Lightning is this exact same cost as the internal combustion version. So what you do is you get the network effect starting to happen
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah.
that's the stuff that doesn't get reported on. I
Right.
think what you're going to see the media pick up on in the next couple of years, worldwide, is these, communities that are cut off because of drought, wildfires, flooding, and those communities, the option for them now is to actually generate and store their own power. So,
Mm.
there's a
Hmm.
whole wave of new adopters coming,
Right.
because of these climate incidents that are happening. They're going to have rooftop solar and batteries and use their cars to
Yeah.
store information, and they're going to work together as a community, a power to community. Now,
Yeah.
we call these kind of distributed energy resources in the tech terms, but reality, what it is, it's community resilience, self-sufficiency, sovereignty, and security.
Right.
And that's kind of a narrative that we're going to start to see more and more kind of happening. So, yeah, so you don't hear too much about the media, but what's interesting right now is if you look in the U.S., it's really interesting is that EV sales are at their highest level ever.
Yeah.
Part of that is because the incoming Trump administration may get rid of the $7,500 tax credit, but also
Yeah.
too, I think people in the U.S. are realizing. I was just in California kind of 2.5 weeks ago, and gas down there is $4.50 US a gallon. Like it's expensive.
Yeah. What's that equivalent for? Is that over $2 a liter
Yeah, it would be
Canadian?
over $2.
Yeah. Wow, that is expensive. Man, that's insane. That's insane. I could not. That's one of the reasons why I went. I have an EV. It's one of the reasons why I went to EV because we were approaching $2 here in Ontario at one point, a couple of years ago in 2022, and I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm like,
Yeah.
my car's coming. It's at that point where if I turn it in, I can do well, but I needed premium gas, and that was going to get more and more expensive. And I just like, no, this is cheaper, and it's true. Now, one thing I'd love to get your answer on when I went to, so if you buy an EV in Canada or you're looking to get an EV in Ontario anyway, you can go to it's like a EV place. Oh, what's the name of it? I forget the name of it, but it's I think it's EV Easy or something like that. But you can go in, they give you all the information on all the different types of EVs, the different types of chargers, what to look for in terms of price of how you're charging it. And the woman there said that at night, like they talked about the breaking the grid if everybody charged at night at the same time, if all of Ontarians had an electric vehicle, and said because at night they change over to nuclear power, it's not only cheaper, but you'll never really run out of
Yeah.
energy. Is that a true thing? Is that really happening? Do you know about that?
Yeah, so there's a reason that the Ontario utilities are wanting you to charge at just over 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is almost free power overnight, and it's
Yeah.
for that very reason is they're trying to load balance across the daily cycle.
Mm,
So more EV owners kind of charging at night is actually
yeah.
a very good thing for them. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it is and it's real. You know, BC, where I live, has a kind of overnight rate that's 5 cents a kilowatt hour, kind of
Yeah.
cheaper than the normal rate. Again, even though we don't have nuclear, we have large hydro reservoirs. But again, these are utilities that are trying to spread a load across the 24-hour period. So, and EVs are very good for doing that.
Yeah, yeah, and I just schedule it through the app. It's great. Like
Yeah.
you don't even have to worry. You just keep the plug in, and then at 9:30 it turns on, and you're all. It takes 2 hours to charge up, and you're all ready to go. It's great, and I've saved so much money. So that's wonderful. So we know it's not going to break the grid. That's clear. The last point I think was what was the last point here? It was German electricity rates between. Oh, it's about Germany, right?
Imports.
The imports.
Or just imports and exports of electricity.
Right.
And there have been a number of commentators kind of looking at various provinces and going, what happens in BC? What's happened in BC with droughts and reservoir levels? I think if you look at the numbers over the last year and a half, BC has imported about 25% of its power. And so the inevitable conclusion from that is that we have some sort of structural electricity deficit and we can't self-generate enough power.
Mhm.
And we're now depending on California and Alberta and a bunch of other kind of other states to bail us out. And when you actually look at, again, we come back to the arbitrage, right? So, yes, we imported over the last year 16% more power than we exported. But the real measure is the value of that power. So for a lot of Canada that has hydro reservoirs, we can hold back water until there's a need and demand requires, and you actually wait till the price spikes, and then you open the reservoir and you sell it to the U.S. So if you look at just BC alone, since 2019, the province has made $1.5 billion in profit on imports and exports. So, what we have been doing is basically buying cheap power in California. And what's super interesting right now is with the amount of solar that's been set up in the US Southwest, they're actually getting to periods where power prices are approaching zero or even negative. And when that happens, the smart thing as utilities somewhere else is to actually buy that power so you don't have to produce it
Mm,
yourself. So what's been happening is utilities in BC are buying power at very low rates, or sometimes even zero or negative rates, and that allows us to kind of hold the water back in our reservoirs until such time as power is needed, and
right.
the price goes up. And that's allowed us to do a couple of things. One is it's allowed utilities like BC Hydro to kind of weather the drought that's been happening here for the last kind of 2 years or so.
Hmm.
I think more importantly, though, it allows us to respond to emergencies. So if you
Mm,
remember this time last year, Alberta went into this massive deep freeze. They sent out
yes.
grid alerts on their phones. People were
Yes.
asked to just, shut down your appliances, stop using electricity. So in that instance, there was plenty of water held behind dams in BC, and BC was able to send an absolute ton of power to
Mm,
Alberta to kind of get over that hump. So,
right.
these are the types of kind of, trading situations that we're seeing more and more of. So, and that's kind of the message we're trying to get out is that, power imports are not a bad thing because it
Right.
allows us to actually prepare for when we need the power and make more money off of it.
Right. So is the big commodity in the future going to be the imports and exports of power? Like, is that going to be one that, is it going to, like, right now we get incentivized to, charge our EVs at night and so forth. The big worry that I hear a lot of people say around me is like, oh, well, wait till everybody's on the grid and everybody needs electricity. They're just going to increase that, and they're just going to increase it to a point where you just, it's going to be just as expensive as gas. Do you see that happening, or from the research that your staff has done and your organization has done, see that happening at all?
And not if you plan correctly.
Mm,
So, and what I mean by that is the more interties you can build between grids, the more stability and reliability you have. So if you have a particular grid somewhere in North America that for whatever reasons is struggling, middle of winter, no sun, no wind, power can come in from elsewhere. So that's the kind of grid that we need to be building. And the more you build that kind of across a continent, whether it's North America, Europe, or elsewhere,
Yeah.
the more stability you have, the more reliability you have, and less likelihood you are going to get that there's going to be a price spike. So, that's one of our large kind of recommendations to the federal government is, one of the things that they can do in the electricity space, because most of it's governed by provincial jurisdiction, is help provinces connect their grids to each other and help provinces connect grids into the US. So, that's kind of part of it. The other one too, and we talked a little bit about this, is that homeowners and communities will have more agency in the future, where they're going to generate and store their own power when they need it.
Right.
And then the third part you already talked about, right, is kind of the innovation aspect of this. So,
Yeah.
as we have this kind of large glut of solar coming into the US Southwest, people are doing innovative things with that. They're turning it into green hydrogen and then holding that until such time as the price goes up. And then you can run the hydrogen through an electrolyzer again and turn it back into power. So there's a whole bunch of kind of clever, innovative ways that we're sort of starting to look at power and kind of how we can sort of monetize it and use it. And again, if you do it wrong, prices go up. But if you do it right, you can actually have a very affordable grid that's incredibly reliable, keep prices low. It helps, again, jurisdictions kind of decarbonize, meet climate targets. And what people forget too is that, when you are fossil fuel powered in your home, you are at the whim of geopolitical events. The oil price isn't set locally. It's not set by your province, not set by your utility. The gas price is exactly the same, and you can find yourself with $2 gas fairly quickly. There's nothing really you can do about it. But an electricity price, if you're living in Ontario and Ontario's made the right moves and you've made the right moves as a homeowner, you can actually weather those price shocks and really help with affordability.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so it seems like a lot more flexibility in going more towards renewables.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. I do have one last question. I couldn't let you go without asking this question. We're looking at a new election. The carbon tax seems to be a really big question here. People hate it. People absolutely, the citizens who have to pay it hate it. Even though there's the proven fact that you get money back. Even though there's proven fact that it hasn't increased inflation, or it's been like a 0.00012% increase in inflation. Well, I guess it's a two-part question. One, has the carbon tax worked since it's been implemented, and how can we tell? And then also, is this going to be scrapped, and how is it going to affect sort of our climate I guess our climate I'm going to try, I can't think of the word, but our climate sort of mandates.
Yeah, so I'll tackle those kind of in the order that you asked.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so carbon pricing does work.
Okay.
It is worldwide seen as the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions. And how it works, and this is where people get a little bit confused, is the carbon tax at the consumer level. So this is the household level, like what you and I pay when we go fill up our car, or, we pay our gas bill or whatnot.
Yeah.
It really does two things and two things only. It changes what you drive and how you drive, and it changes how you heat your home. Like those are the two main things that the carbon tax does. So just kind of keep in mind on that, because we're going to come back to it. And if you look at, places and jurisdictions that have had a carbon tax in place for a long time, British Columbia's had a carbon tax since 2009. And if you look at emissions intensity per capita, per unit of GDP, the line goes down. So carbon taxes are a big part of that, and they actually have driven change, both in the industrial level and the behavioral level. Now, there's two separate carbon taxes in Canada. And the one that people are most upset about and they hear about in the Axadax campaigns, that is the consumer carbon price. It's called the fuel charge, under the federal system. So that is the X cents a liter that you pay, and what you pay on your gas bill when you kind of go to pay that every month.
Yeah.
There's also an industrial carbon pricing system, and it's called the output-based pricing system. Some provinces have their own system. Alberta has one, BC has one. So when you look at kind of overall on the consumer system, What you're seeing these days is the cost between an internal combustion car and an EV is, they're coming closer together. And if you actually look at kind of the total ownership costs, the EV wins every time. And if you keep your car for 8 years and you drive it 20,000 kilometers a year, you're going to save a ton of money with the EV. The
Yeah.
capital cost up front is a little bit higher,
Yeah.
but overall the savings. So, what the carbon tax, its intent is to actually help you make that choice to buy the EV over the gas car. And in that
Right.
respect, it has kind of worked. We're also looking at heat pumps versus natural gas furnaces. And again, if you look at most jurisdictions across Canada, the math is starting to come out in the heat pump favor, especially when
Mm.
you factor in the fact that you get air conditioning for free out of a heat pump. So,
Ah, that's
from
huge.
our perspective is, carbon tax has done a lot of its heavy lifting on the consumer side already.
Yeah.
And, it would be a shame if it went away,
Yeah.
because it still has work to do. But it's not the end of the world, right?
Right.
People are still going to buy EVs. People are still going to buy heat pumps.
Yeah.
The math still works out on EVs. The
Right.
math works out a little bit less on heat pumps, but that could change shortly. So, the way we look at carbon pricing at the consumer level is it has done a lot of heavy lifting and it's done its job. If it goes away, there are other ways to make up that delta to help you meet your climate targets.
Gotcha.
On the industrial carbon pricing system, those are very, very robust. And what you're seeing now is you're seeing a lot of industries coming to the federal conservatives, who are may form the next government. It's looking likely, kind of going, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Alberta intends, whatever happens at the federal level after the next election, to keep its industrial carbon pricing system. BC
Mm.
will most likely do otherwise. Quebec's got cap and trade.
Yeah.
So on the industrial side, I think we're seeing a lot more likelihood of longevity on carbon pricing.
And we're
So
seeing change within that too. Like we're seeing
yeah,
industrial change, like to go more towards cleaner ways of doing business.
well, and that's just it. And the
Yeah.
other one too, the business community and industry, they want to know what the rules are, right? Because, if they know that carbon pricing is going to stay in some shape or form for the next 10 years, that helps them make their capital investments kind of right now. And
Right.
right now, we've got a lot of investment dollars in Canada sitting on the sidelines because they're not sure what an incoming government is going to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. True. It's interesting. It makes it interesting because I think that the one thing from a citizen's point of view is we just don't see the results right off the bat. We don't see it. Everybody's like, well, the always the loaded question is like, well, how much has our emissions reduced because of it, and
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff, and we just don't see it because the emissions are usually a year behind, and when we measure and stuff, but we just don't see it right off the bat. But it is a slow burn, no pun intended,
Yeah.
but it is slow to change, and everybody is going to change as we go forward, whether it's for a carbon tax or a pricing point or just ease of not having to go to the gas station anymore, and just
Yeah.
charging at home and for a lot cheaper.
And the other thing that under the consumer carbon tax, under the federal system, which is in place for a number of provinces, is 80% of families are better off with the consumer carbon price. So basically, they get more back on their rebates than
Yes.
they're actually paying for the fuel
Yeah.
that they burn. So, they're in that respect, the federal system is quite elegant in that,
Yeah.
most Canadians are better off. And yeah, the provinces that have their own systems, run them a little bit differently, and they have kind of different results in that calculus. But generally, carbon pricing, it works,
It
and
works.
it has been a good idea.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens after the election to see if it stays or not, depending on who gets in. But regardless of what happens, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and letting us know all about the different ways that renewable energy can help and how it can help not only our planet but ourselves in terms of helping out at the wallet. So we really appreciate you taking time to doing what you do and coming on and telling us all this stuff. And then obviously, again, thank you so much for what you and your team continually do. I think it's a necessity here in Canada to know what we have in terms of clean energy and where we're going and some of the challenges and successes that we're accomplishing.
Great. Well, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mark, for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was such a fun interview to do. I love doing these interviews because I hear so much information, so much misinformation, not only from media outlets, but also from people around me just being like, what about this? What about this? And questions and questions and questions that sometimes I can't answer. I don't know everything. I wish I did. I don't know everything. I just get it from the people that I interview and the articles that I get my information from. And so to be able to have Mark come in with, the information that his staff, his organization looks out for and reports on all the time is just so nice to have, and know that we're in our country, in our world, we're actually headed towards a really great place when it comes to innovation on renewables and coming into implementing renewable energy and being able to live off of renewable energy and even go into more of like being more dependent on ourselves in the future. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens, but I'm going to be sharing this interview with a lot of people, I can tell you that. But this is a lot of fun, but I want to hear your comments. I'm going to put the website of Clean Energy Canada in the show notes, in the description, so you can just go below or in the show notes, depending on where you're watching. If you're watching on YouTube or wherever, Apple Podcasts, you're listening to this, or you're watching this on Spotify, just go into the description of the show notes, and you'll be able to click on that website. But also, if you want to get a hold of me and you want to ask me questions or you have any comments on this episode, please feel free to comment below if you're on YouTube or if you're on Spotify, or DM me at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. That's at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. And of course, if this is you're new to this and you haven't listened to the podcast a lot, but you want to get more episodes, just click subscribe and hit that notification bell on YouTube, and of course hit follow on all the other podcasting platforms that you're a part of in your favorite podcast platform. So thank you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Angelo. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.